Witness the impossible rise of a teenage peasant girl who commanded armies, crowned kings, and shattered the destiny of two empires, only to burn at the stake before her 20th birthday. This is not a fairy tale. This is the raw, unfiltered story of Joan of Arc, a girl who heard voices in the fields, defied the most powerful men in Europe, and changed the course of the 100 Years' War with nothing but faith, fire, and an iron will that still echoes through the centuries. A 17-year-old girl who couldn't read or write walks into a room full of battle-hardened knights and tells them God has sent her to save France. They laugh. Within months, she's leading their armies. Within a year, she's crowning their king. Within 2 years, she's burning alive, and France is reborn. How? Why? And what if everything you thought you knew about Joan of Arc was a lie designed to hide something far stranger? Segment 1. Before the legend, life in the shadows. The village of Domrémy sits like a forgotten scar on the eastern edge of France, pressed against the borderlands where kingdoms blur and wars never truly end. The year is 1412, and this is a world where children learn to run before they learn their prayers, not toward anything, but away. Away from the English, away from the Burgundians, away from the mercenaries who serve no flag but their own greed. Joan is born into smoke and uncertainty. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, is a peasant farmer of modest standing, respected enough to collect taxes for the local lord, but poor enough that his hands are perpetually stained with soil and his back bent from decades of labor. Her mother, Isabelle Romy, teaches Joan the only things a peasant girl needs to know: how to spin wool, how to tend livestock, how to keep your head down and your mouth shut when soldiers pass through. The house is small, packed earth floors, a roof that leaks when the rains come hard. In winter, the family huddles around a fire that barely keeps the cold at bay, and Joan shares a sleeping space with her brothers and sister, bodies pressed together for warmth. There are 5 children in total: Jacquemin, Jeanne, Pierre, Catherine, and Joan. The boys will inherit what little there is. Catherine will marry if a dowry can be scraped together. Joan's future is already written: marriage to a local farmer, children, work, and an early grave. But Domrémy is not a place of peace. It sits in a contested region, claimed by both the Duchy of Bar and the Duchy of Lorraine, and the 100 Years' War has turned the entire landscape into a chessboard where peasants are the pieces most easily sacrificed. English armies sweep through like locusts. Burgundian raiders burn villages for sport. The fields are never fully planted because no one knows if they'll be alive to harvest. Joan grows up watching smoke rise from neighboring settlements, hearing the screams carried on the wind, learning that survival means knowing when to hide. She is not remarkable. Not yet. She is a girl with calloused hands and dirty feet who spends her days herding sheep and her evenings spinning thread by firelight. She is devout. Yes, more devout than her siblings, constantly slipping away to the village church of Saint Remy to kneel before the altar and pray until her knees ache. The other children mock her for it. They call her Joan the Saint, with sneers on their lips. She doesn't care. The church is the one place where the world makes sense, where the chaos outside can be held at bay by stone walls and whispered prayers. But even the church cannot keep the war out forever. Joan is 13 when the raids intensify. She watches from the hills as English-allied Burgundian forces torch the outskirts of Domrémy, driving villagers into the fields like cattle. Her family flees to the nearby fortified town of Neufchâteau, abandoning their home, their livestock, everything. They return weeks later to find their house ransacked, their stores emptied. Her father weeps in the ruins, a sound Joan will never forget. It is the sound of a man realizing that all his years of work, all his sacrifices, mean nothing when kingdoms decide to wage war. Joan begins hearing the voices that summer. She is alone in her father's garden, the midday sun pressing down, when the world suddenly shifts. A light brighter than anything natural floods her vision, and within that light, figures emerge: Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret. They speak to her in voices that bypass her ears and resonate directly in her soul. They tell her she has been chosen. They tell her France is dying. They tell her she must save it. She tells no one. Not at first. How do you explain the inexplicable? How does a 13-year-old peasant girl tell her family that saints are visiting her, that God has given her a mission, that the fate of the kingdom rests on her shoulders? She continues her chores, continues spinning wool, continues herding sheep. But the voices return. Again and again. They grow more insistent, more specific. They tell her to go to the Dauphin Charles, the uncrowned heir to the French throne. They tell her to lead armies. They tell her to reclaim France from the English. Joan is 16 when she finally acts. Her father has arranged a marriage for her, a local man, stable, reliable, exactly the future she was always meant to have. Joan refuses. Her father is furious. In peasant society, a daughter's defiance is unthinkable. He threatens her. He rages. But Joan stands firm, and when he pushes the matter to the ecclesiastical court in Toul, she argues her own case and wins. A 16-year-old girl with no education, no legal training, facing down the authority of the church and her own father, and she wins. The voices grow louder. They give her a deadline. She must reach the Dauphin before the city of Orleans falls to the English. If Orleans falls, France falls. If France falls, the mission fails. Joan knows what she must do, but she also knows how impossible it is. She is a peasant girl with no money, no connections, no training. The Dauphin is hundreds of miles away in Chinon, through territory crawling with enemy forces. She has never ridden a horse. She has never held a sword. She has never been more than a day's walk from Domrémy. But Joan is not asking for permission anymore. She is done waiting. She goes to the local garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, and demands an escort to Chinon. He laughs in her face. She returns. He dismisses her. She returns again, and again, and again. For months, she wears him down with sheer relentless will, this teenage girl who refuses to take no for an answer. She cuts her hair short, dresses in men's clothing, and transforms herself from Joan the peasant into something the world has never seen before. The winter of 1429 is brutal. Snow chokes the roads. Wolves prowl the forests. English patrols hunt anyone foolish enough to travel. But Joan, along with a small escort of 6 men provided by a finally relenting Baudricourt, rides out into the darkness. She has no armor, no weapon, just faith, fury, and the voices in her head telling her she will survive. 11 days. 11 days riding through hostile territory, sleeping in frozen fields, avoiding English patrols by sheer luck or divine intervention. Joan rides through it all without complaint, without fear, her conviction so absolute that the hardened soldiers escorting her begin to believe. By the time they reach Chinon, she is no longer just a peasant girl with delusions of grandeur. She is something else, something the world doesn't have a word for yet. Segment 2. Rise of the Warrior, the Path to Glory. The throne room at Chinon Castle is a test. The Dauphin Charles, skeptical and desperate in equal measure, has hidden himself among his courtiers. 50 men in fine clothing fill the hall, and Joan has never met Charles before. She has no idea what he looks like, but she walks directly to him, kneels, and says, "Gentle Dauphin, I am Joan the maid, sent by the King of Heaven to tell you that you will be crowned at Reims." Charles is stunned. The court is silent. How did she know? Chroniclers will debate this for centuries. Some say divine revelation. Some say clever informants. Joan never explains. She simply continues, and in a private audience, she tells Charles something that convinces him beyond doubt, a secret prayer he had made, alone, that no living soul knew. Charles believes. That belief changes everything. But the nobles and military commanders do not believe. They demand proof. They subject Joan to 3 weeks of theological interrogation at Poitiers, where scholars and priests question every aspect of her claims. They examine her virginity to ensure she is not a witch. They test her knowledge of Scripture. They try to trip her up, to expose her as a fraud. Joan, who cannot read, who has no formal education, answers every question with a clarity that unsettles even her interrogators. When asked for a sign, she replies, "I did not come to Poitiers to give signs. Take me to Orleans, and I will show you the signs I was sent to accomplish." The commission declares her orthodox and sends her to Orleans. The military commanders still doubt. Orleans has been under English siege for 6 months. The city is starving, its walls crumbling, its defenders exhausted. The English have built a ring of fortifications around the city that seems impregnable. France's greatest generals have tried and failed to break the siege. And now this teenage girl in armor arrives and tells them she will lift it in days. Joan receives her armor, custom-made white plate with the fleur-de-lis of France emblazoned across it. She is given a sword, but not just any sword. She sends men to the church of St. Catherine de Fierbois and tells them exactly where to dig behind the altar. They find a sword buried there, ancient and rusted but bearing 5 crosses on its blade. When cleaned, it gleams like new. The soldiers whisper that it is a miracle. Joan simply says it is the weapon the voices told her she would carry. But Joan refuses to use it. Throughout her entire military career, she never kills a single enemy. Her weapon is a banner, white, emblazoned with the image of Christ and the words, Jesus Maria. She charges into battle holding it high, leading from the front, inspiring soldiers who have lost all hope. She does not fight with steel. She fights with conviction. Orleans becomes her proving ground. On April 29, 1429, Joan enters the city to a rapturous reception. The people see her as a savior, a saint, the answer to their prayers. The military commanders see her as a liability, a religious fanatic who will get herself and everyone around her killed. They try to exclude her from war councils. They make plans without consulting her. Joan forces her way in. She demands action. She demands aggression. The commanders want to wait for reinforcements. Joan wants to attack immediately. On May 4th, Joan leads an assault on the English fortification of St. Leu. The French soldiers, inspired by her fearless charge, storm the walls and take the fort. Joan weeps over the English dead, praying for their souls even as the battle rages. It is the first French victory in months. 2 days later, Joan leads an assault on the fortification of Les Tourelles, the key to the English siege. An arrow punches through her shoulder, driving deep into her flesh. The pain is excruciating. Her soldiers panic, thinking she is done. Joan pulls the arrow out herself, refuses treatment beyond a bandage, and returns to the battle. She plants her banner on the walls of Les Tourelles. The English, demoralized and terrified of this girl who seems unkillable, retreat. The siege of Orleans is broken. 9 days. Joan accomplished in 9 days what France's best generals could not do in 6 months. The English forces retreat. Orleans is saved. France has hope again. And Joan of Arc is no longer a peasant girl. She is the Maid of Orleans, the warrior saint, the symbol of French resistance. But she does not stop. The voices urge her forward. They tell her the next step. Charles must be crowned at Reims, the traditional site of French coronations, deep in English-held territory. The military commanders say it is impossible. Joan says it is necessary. Charles, emboldened by Orleans, agrees to try. Joan leads a lightning campaign through the Loire Valley. City after city falls to her advance. Jargeau, Mons-sur-Loire, Beaugency. At Patay, French forces under Joan's banner smash an English army, killing or capturing over half their force while suffering minimal losses. It is a complete reversal of decades of English dominance. The myth of English invincibility is shattered. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII is crowned King of France at Reims Cathedral. Joan stands beside him, holding her banner, tears streaming down her face. She has done it. Against all odds, against all reason, a teenage peasant girl has changed the course of history. France has a crowned king again. The tide of the 100 Years' War has turned. But crowning a king does not end a war. The English still hold Paris. Burgundy still opposes Charles. And Joan, despite her victories, is still seen as a threat by many in the French court. Nobles who owe their power to careful politics and ancient bloodlines resent this peasant girl who wields influence through divine mandate alone. Generals who spent their lives mastering warfare resent taking orders from someone who learned strategy from saints. Joan presses for an assault on Paris. Charles hesitates. The momentum slows. Political maneuvering replaces military action. Joan, frustrated, leads an attack on Paris in September 1429 without full royal support. She is struck in the thigh by a crossbow bolt. The assault fails. Charles orders a retreat, and for the first time, Joan's aura of invincibility cracks. The voices still speak to her, but now they bring darker messages. They tell her she will not last the year. They tell her she will be betrayed. Joan continues fighting anyway. leading smaller campaigns through the winter of 1429 and spring of 1430. But the support has dried up. The resources are gone. She is operating on the margins now, a symbol the king has used and no longer needs. On May 23, 1430, Joan is defending the town of Compiègne from Burgundian forces. In the chaos of a skirmish, she is surrounded and pulled from her horse. The gates of Compiègne close before she can retreat. She is captured. France's greatest warrior, the Maid of Orleans, the girl who crowned a king, is now a prisoner of war. And her real trial is about to begin. Segment 3. Myths, Secrets, and Unsolved Mysteries. Joan's capture sends shockwaves through France and England alike. But what happens next reveals mysteries that historians still debate 5 centuries later. Because Joan of Arc is not ransomed. She is not exchanged. She is sold. The Burgundians, nominal allies of England, sell Joan to the English for 10,000 livres, a staggering sum that reveals how badly the English want her silenced. But here is where the story becomes strange. The English do not execute her as a prisoner of war. They do not imprison her as a political hostage. Instead, they hand her over to the church. They accuse her of heresy. They claim her voices are demonic, her victories the work of witchcraft, her male clothing an abomination before God. Why? If Joan is just a soldier, just a figurehead, why go through the elaborate charade of a religious trial? The answer lies in what Joan represents. Her victories were not won through superior numbers or tactics. They were won through belief. French soldiers followed her because they believed God was on her side. If the English can prove she is a heretic, a witch, a fraud, they can retroactively delegitimize every French victory. They can declare that Charles VII coronation was presided over by a servant of Satan, making his kingship invalid. Joan is more dangerous dead than alive, but only if she dies condemned by the church. The trial begins in January 1431 in Rouen, deep in English-occupied territory. The tribunal is led by Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a man with deep ties to the English crown and Burgundian faction. The trial is a sham from the start. Joan is held in chains in a military prison, guarded by English soldiers who mock and threaten her. She is denied legal counsel. She is interrogated for hours by teams of theologians who rotate in shifts while she stands alone. She is 19 years old. But Joan does not break. The trial transcripts, which survive to this day, reveal something astonishing. This illiterate peasant girl verbally outmaneuvers some of the most educated minds in Europe. When asked if she knows she is in God's grace, a trap question theologians debate for years, she answers, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God keep me there." When asked why she wears men's clothing, she explains it is for protection from assault in a military prison. When pressed about her voices, she refuses to denounce them no matter how much pressure is applied. The judges are frustrated. They need a confession. They need her to admit the voices were demonic. Joan refuses. For months, the trial drags on. The English grow impatient. They threaten torture. They bring her to the torture chamber, show her the instruments. Joan does not waver. Finally, desperate, they concoct a charge of relapse. In May 1431, exhausted and terrified by threats that she will be burned immediately, Joan signs a document she cannot read, abjuring her voices and agreeing to wear women's clothing. She is sentenced to life imprisonment. But 3 days later, she is wearing men's clothing again. Joan later claims her dress was taken from her cell, leaving her no choice. Others suggest she chose to resume male clothing deliberately, knowing what it would mean. Either way, the result is the same. She is declared a relapsed heretic and sentenced to death. But here is where legend and mystery intertwine. In the years following Joan's death, stories emerge. Villagers claim to have seen her alive. A woman calling herself Joan appears in various French towns, and some of Joan's own brothers publicly acknowledge her as their sister. The false Joan phenomenon spreads. Who were these women? Opportunists? Or something stranger? And then there is the matter of Joan's ring. She wore a simple ring given by her parents, which she claimed held no magical properties. But after her capture, she gave it to the church. The ring disappeared for centuries, only to resurface in 1947, sold by an English cardinal. Today it is held in a French museum, but its journey through 500 years remains mysterious. What was so important about this ring that it was preserved while so much else was lost? More mysteries surround Joan's voices. Modern scholars have attempted psychological explanations: schizophrenia, epilepsy, religious ecstasy. But none of these fully explain Joan's tactical military genius, her ability to locate hidden swords, her knowledge of court secrets. The voices gave her information she could not have known. How? Some researchers have explored the possibility that Joan was part of a larger network, that her voices were code for human intelligence sources, that her mission was carefully orchestrated by factions within the French court who needed a symbol uncorrupted by politics. If true, it would explain the precision of her early successes and the sudden withdrawal of support once she had served her purpose. But no evidence has ever emerged to prove such a conspiracy. The Church itself could not escape the mysteries. In 1456, 25 years after Joan's execution, Pope Calixtus III authorized a retrial. The original verdict was overturned. Joan was declared innocent, a martyr. But why the delay? Why did the Church wait a quarter century? Some historians suggest political maneuvering. France was finally winning the 100 Years' War decisively, and Charles VII wanted Joan's legacy cleared to solidify his own legitimacy. Others point to genuine theological concern that an innocent had been murdered by church corruption. In 1909, Joan was beatified. In 1920, she was canonized as a saint. The church that burned her now venerates her. How do we reconcile these two images, Joan the heretic and Joan the saint? They are the same person, viewed through different lenses of power, politics, and faith. And what of Joan's final words? As the flames rose around her at the stake on May 30th, 1431, witnesses report she cried out, "Jesus," repeatedly until the smoke choked off her voice. Her executioner later claimed he saw a white dove fly from the flames. English soldiers reported they could not fully burn her heart and organs, requiring a second burning. These reports, documented by multiple sources, suggest something beyond the ordinary, something that defies rational explanation even centuries later. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not how Joan did what she did, but why the world could not let her. A girl who threatened no one personally, who sought no power for herself, who only wanted to save her country, and both sides conspired to destroy her for it. The English feared her symbol. The French court feared her independence. The Church feared her direct line to God that bypassed their authority. She was too pure for the world she lived in, and the world could not tolerate that. Segment 4. Power, Glory, and the World They Left Behind. In the halls of power where kings and bishops played their chess games with nations, Joan of Arc was always an anomaly, a piece that did not fit the board. While she rode into battle on horseback, covered in the mud and blood of war, the men who commanded her fate sat in perfumed chambers, their hands soft, their bellies full, their greatest risk a loss of prestige. Charles VII, the king Joan crowned, is perhaps the greatest example of this divide. When Joan first found him, he was not a king but the Dauphin, a dispossessed prince whose own mother had signed a treaty declaring him illegitimate. He was weak-willed, indecisive, controlled by advisors and mistresses. Joan gave him a kingdom. She risked her life, endured wounds, and rallied a nation to put him on his throne. And when she needed him, when she was captured and imprisoned, Charles VII did nothing. He made no attempt to ransom her. He sent no rescue. He simply continued ruling the kingdom she had won for him. Why? The answer is as old as power itself. Joan was useful when France needed a miracle. But once the miracle was accomplished, she became inconvenient. She owed allegiance to God, not to courtly politics. She could not be bribed, could not be seduced, could not be controlled. She spoke truth to power without fear, and that made her dangerous to everyone. Charles and his advisors knew that a peasant girl with divine authority was a threat to the entire feudal order. If God could speak to Joan, why not to any other peasant? The foundation of medieval society rested on the idea that power flowed from God to king, to noble, to common folk. Joan's existence suggested God might skip those middle steps. So Charles let her fall. And when she burned, he mourned publicly while breathing a private sigh of relief. Only later, when her legend had grown too large to ignore, did he rehabilitate her memory. In 1456, he sponsored the retrial that cleared her name. By then, Joan could be safely transformed into a symbol, no longer a living, breathing challenge to authority, but a useful martyr whose image could be controlled. The English ruling class had their own reasons to fear Joan, but theirs was more straightforward. She was winning. For decades, English kings had claimed the throne of France through convoluted bloodlines and military conquest. Henry V had brought France to its knees at Agincourt. His infant son, Henry VI, was declared King of France and England both. The English nobility had invested fortunes and lives into maintaining their French territories. And then a peasant girl in homemade armor started destroying their armies and their legitimacy. The English could have killed Joan quickly as a prisoner of war. Instead, they spent months and a fortune staging an elaborate church trial. They needed her destroyed, not just physically but spiritually. They needed her condemned by God. The trial was a political necessity dressed in religious robes, and every noble in England understood this. They watched the proceedings with satisfaction, believing that once Joan was branded a heretic, French morale would collapse. They were wrong. Joan's execution had the opposite effect. Her death transformed her from a controversial figure into a martyr. French soldiers who had doubted her during life believed in her after death. The English position in France continued to crumble. By 1453, the 100 Years' War ended with French victory. England lost all its continental territories except Calais. The war Joan turned with her intervention was finally won. But the nobles of France who benefited from Joan's victories were quick to minimize her role once the war ended. Military chronicles written by aristocratic generals barely mention her. Court histories credit Charles VII's wise leadership and the skill of his commanders. Joan becomes a footnote, an interesting anecdote. It would take centuries before historians fully appreciated her military genius and the sheer improbability of what she accomplished. The Church's relationship with Joan reveals the deepest contradictions. In 1431, Church authorities burned her as a heretic. In 1456, Church authorities declared her innocent. In 1909, Church authorities declared her blessed. In 1920, Church authorities declared her a saint. The same institution that killed her now holds her up as a model of faith. How do we make sense of this? The answer lies in understanding that the Church is not a monolithic entity, but a human institution subject to politics, corruption, and change. The men who condemned Joan in 1431 were largely allied with England and Burgundy. The men who exonerated her in 1456 served a French king who needed her legacy. The men who canonized her in 1920 led a church seeking to demonstrate its connection to genuine piety in an increasingly secular world. Joan herself remained constant. The Church's interpretation of her changed with the political winds. And what of the ordinary people, the soldiers who followed her, the peasants who saw in her a reflection of themselves? For them, Joan was never a political symbol or theological problem. She was proof that God had not forgotten them, that a common girl could speak with saints, that the powerful could be defied. When news of her execution spread, people wept in the streets. They built shrines to her memory. They told stories of her miracles. The official church may have condemned her, but popular religion canonized her immediately. Joan's legacy rippled out in unexpected ways. She became a symbol for French nationalism, invoked by everyone from Napoleon to Charles de Gaulle to the French resistance during World War II. But she was also claimed by conservatives for her piety and by feminists for her defiance of gender norms. Monarchists celebrated her loyalty to the crown. Republicans celebrated her peasant origins. Catholics venerated her as a saint. Secularists admired her courage. Everyone saw in Joan what they needed to see. The sites of her life became pilgrimage destinations. Domrémy, the village she was born in, now hosts a basilica built in her honor. Orleans celebrates her every May with a festival. Rouen, the city where she died, marks the spot of her execution with a church and memorial. These are not just tourist attractions, but living connections to a woman who lived 600 years ago, yet still feels immediate, still feels present. Perhaps the most powerful legacy is the simplest. Joan proved it was possible. Possible for a girl with no advantages, no connections, no wealth or education, to change the world through sheer force of conviction. In an age of rigid hierarchy and predetermined destiny, she shattered every rule and rewrote what was possible. Nobles and kings and bishops spent their lives accumulating power through careful maneuvering and ruthless ambition. Joan spent 19 years on Earth, barely more than one in the public eye, and accomplished more than most of them could in their entire lives. The world Joan left behind was not the world she entered. When she was born, France was a dying kingdom, occupied and humiliated. When she died, France was resurgent, its king crowned, its enemies in retreat. She did not live to see the war's end, but the end was inevitable once she turned the tide. A peasant girl with voices in her head had bent history to her will. The powerful always try to claim her now, to use her image for their own purposes. But Joan belongs to none of them. She belongs to the forgotten, the dismissed, the ones told their dreams are impossible. She belongs to everyone who has ever been underestimated and everyone who has ever refused to accept the limits placed upon them. She belongs to the moment when faith overcomes fear and ordinary people accomplish the extraordinary. Joan of Arc lived 19 years. She fought for one. She changed everything. They burned her body, but they could not burn what she represented. 5 centuries later, the smoke from that pyre in Rouen still rises, carrying her name across generations, a reminder that power has its limits and that sometimes, just sometimes, God speaks to peasant girls and the world is never the same again.